I spoke yesterday to Professor Ronen Itzhak, and he said to me that this is a gathering of experts, and that most of the participants would be familiar with my work on Jordan. And he suggested that it would be most interesting for the participants if I spoke in a personal vein on the personal aspects of King Hussein's in Israel. So I'd like to change slightly the title of my introductory remarks to King Hussein in Israel, a personal perspective. And I propose to speak for about 30 minutes and to leave 15 minutes for questions and answers. Jordanian-Israeli relations are not a straightforward bilateral relationship. It's more complicated because it's a triangle that involves Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinians. Abdan Abu Odeh, the long-time Palestinian political advisor to King Hussein, once compared the situation to a room in which there are three men and two chairs. And the question is, which of the three men would occupy two of the chairs? Israel solidly occupies one chair, and the real question is whether the other chair would be occupied by Jordan or by the Palestinians. I've written two books about Jordan. The first one, which came out in 1988, is Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine. This book was banned in Jordan, and it is still banned in Jordan today. But when it came out, the Royal Court ordered 20 copies from Al-Saqi bookshop in London, and apparently there was a real panic in the Royal Court. Prince Hassan thought that, going by my name, he thought that this was a right-wing Zionist agenda intended to pave the way, intended to delegitimize the Hashemite dynasty and to pave the way to Jordanese Palestine. How wrong he was. On the other hand, Walid Khalidi, who served for a time as an advisor to King Hussein, told me that the king read it, and he understood that it wasn't an attack on his grandfather, and that indeed reading the book influenced his decision to disengage from the West Bank at the end of July 1988. In Israel, there was a fierce attack on my book and the book of my fellow new historians, Ben Norris and Ilan Pankey. Shabtai Tevet led the Zionist counteroffensive in a series of 3 full-page articles in Haaretz. Then there were critiques by Raham Sela, Yoav Gerber, Ephraim Karsh, and most recently, Yitzhak Ronen. I'm sorry, Ronen Yitzhak. And here is his book, Cooperation and Hostility, Abdallah, the Arab Legion, and the 1948 War. I concede that the title, Collusion, is too strong, but I do not concede that the basic thesis of the book is wrong. I still stand by the thesis, but this is not the place to pursue the argument about 1948. I have written an article in the International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies in 1995 called The Debate on 1948, in which I examined the 5 or 6 main bones of contention in the debate between the old and the new historians, and I replied to my Israeli critics. My second book on Jordan is called Lion. It came out in 2007. It's called Lion of Jordan, The Life of King Hussein in War and Peace. This book was translated into Hebrew and into Arabic. I regret the title. It wasn't my title. It was one that was almost imposed on me by my publishers. And it's a pity. And I spoke to Hussein, who greatly liked collusion across the Jordan and wrote a long article about it at the time in Al-Ahram, because he was anti-Hashemite and he used it as a way of exposing the treachery of the Hashemites to the Arab cause. But he said to me he didn't like the title Lion of Jordan because King Hussein wasn't a lion. He was a fox. I should have called the book Tachlab al-Jordan, the Fox of Jordan. And the book is a comprehensive political biography, but the most important part, if you wish, the beating heart of the book is about the secret meetings between King Hussein and Israeli officials. There is an appendix at the end of the book in which I list 42 secret meetings that I'm aware of. There may have been others that I'm not aware of. And the sheer number of meetings is a testimony to the intensity of this unique dialogue across the battle lines. This conference is about 100 years of the Hashemite regime in Jordan, and I would like to take my cue from this title and to look at Hashemite-Zionist relations in a long-term historical perspective. I will begin by saying that there is a distinct Hashemite tradition of moderation towards the Jews and towards Zionism. This tradition goes back to Hussein, the Sharif of Mecca, who educated his children to treat the Jews with respect as the people of the book. King Abdullah was he embodied this Hashemite tradition of tolerance towards other religions and moderation, political moderation towards the Zionist movement. Abdullah, to his dying day, literally to his dying day, strove to reach a peace agreement with Israel. Fuad Ajami reviewed collusion across the Jordan in a long article in the New Republic under the title The King of Realism. It's an apt title for King Abdullah, and I think it's an equally apt title for King Hussein of Jordan, the King of Realism. Hussein, too, was part of this Hashemite tradition. In his introduction to his grandfather's second volume of memoirs, Al-Takmila, My Memoirs Completed, Hussein highlights the pragmatism and realism of his grandfather. If we look at Hussein's entire political career, I think he emerges as a peacemaker. True, he made mistakes and he paid the price. He lost half his kingdom. But in a long-term historical perspective, he really stands out as a man dedicated to the search for peace. My first meeting with King Hussein occurred in 1989 when he came to give a talk at Oxford. I met him after the talk and he said to me, "You have written about us. Would you like to come to Jordan and see for yourself what we are like?" I said, I was stunned. I said, I would love to, but how would I do it? How would I do it? And he said to me, just drop me a line. So I dropped him a line, and he invited me and my family to visit Jordan in 1990. And I was the king's guest, but I was only allowed to meet very senior officials and only vice presidents or presidents of universities. I was not allowed to meet ordinary sort of lecturers or other academics. And my Palestinian friends thought that I had sold out, but I had not. My second meeting with King Hussein happened in 1996 in his house in Muscat. I was writing a book on Israel and the Arab world, the book that became The Iron Wall. And I wrote to King Hussein and said, I'm writing a book on Israel and the Arab world, including a chapter on Jordan. And all we know about the secret meetings with Israeli officials is what Israelis have leaked. I was very curious about the story, so he said fine, and his secretary phoned me one evening at home, and she said, His Majesty will be ready to meet you tomorrow morning at 10 in Ascot. So I didn't have long to prepare, but I turned up at Ascot the following morning. I was immediately impressed by King Hussein's social skills. He put me at ease. He treated me as an equal. He said to me, I'm very interested in what you write, so please make a point of sending me a copy of everything that you write. And he also said, I think we're interested in the same thing, meaning peace, although I was more interested in history and in the past than in the actual search for peace. The two qualities that stood out for me about the man were his humility and his humanity. Did my acquaintance with King Hussein affect my attitude towards him? You bet it did. It certainly did. I knew His Great Majesty only slightly, but I liked him a great deal. And when I came to write his biography, the problem, what I had to guard against was not to allow biography to topple into hagiography. The interview lasted 2 hours. It revolved around Hussein's relations with Israel, especially the secret meetings. As far as I know, this was the only time that he spoke on the record about these secret meetings. I asked him questions about specific meetings he had with various Israeli leaders. He answered them in general terms, but he said to me, I'm not very good with dates, but I have all my notes back home, and I'll be more than happy to share them with you. Very unfortunately, I did not take him up on his offer because I had enough material for the Iron Wall, and I thought when I finished that, then I'll go back to him. But by that time, in 1998, he was ill, so I missed my opportunity to have another conversation with the king with the help of his records. I spent a lot of time in search for his notes and his records in Amman, but to no avail. The first question that I put to King Hussein in the interview was this. Talking to Israel is broke the biggest Arab taboo, and he took a huge risk in meeting with the Israelis. So why did he take the risk? And his reply roughly as follows. The Jews were in our midst. We didn't want them here, but history had put them here. And I, as an Arab in a position of authority, wanted to meet with them. I didn't want it second-hand. I wanted to meet with them face-to-face to see what they were about, what was the shape of the problem, and what could be done about it. And by chance, I had a good friend who looked after my health here in London. This was a reference to his personal physician, Dr. Emmanuel Herbert, who was a Jew and an ardent Zionist. And Dr. Herbert suggested the possibility for meeting, and that's how it started. In the interview, we covered a lot of ground. The Israeli policy of military retaliation in the 1950s and its destabilizing consequences for Jordan. The 1967 war, post-war diplomacy, Black September, the October War, and the warning, if it was a warning, that King Hussein gave Golda Meir 2 weeks before the outbreak of the war. The futile meetings that Hussein had with Rabin and Peres during Rabin's first term in office, the London Agreement of 1987, the meeting with Yitzhak Shamir in the house in Ascot just prior to the outbreak of the Gulf War in 1991, the peace treaty, and Hussein's deep disappointment with Benjamin Netanyahu. After the king died, I published an edited version of this interview, first in Yediot Achronot, under the heading Hussein bli tzenzura, Hussein without censorship. The next day, this interview was translated into an Arabic newspaper, I forget which, that it caused sensation in Amman. Officials couldn't believe that the king had told an Israeli all the secrets that he kept from them. And thirdly, the book was published, the interview was published in the New York Review of Books under the heading His Royal Shyness, King Hussein and Israel. When I met Queen Noor, I said to her that her husband had been remarkably frank with me about his clandestine meetings with Israelis, and she said to me, it's because he trusted you completely. So this interview is an important source for the biography. As you know, Jordan has no national archives, although there is a rural archive which is separate. I therefore had to rely heavily on oral history. All in all, I conducted about 100 interviews with Jordanian, Israeli, British, and American politicians, officials. I have deposited my personal papers in the Middle East Center archive at St. Anthony's College, where I'm a fellow, or emeritus fellow, and I'm about to add to my personal collection of papers a folder, a very thick folder, with the transcripts and notes of all the interviews with the catalogue for the use of other scholars. In the Israel State Archives, I ordered the files on the secret meetings between Hussein and the Israelis, and although more than 30 years had elapsed, these files were not released. They were still classified. This was a major frustration, but I managed to find another avenue to these files by talking to the daughter of Dr. Yaakov Herzog, Shira Herzog, and she gave me what was called the Charles file. That's a thick file of her father's papers to do with the negotiations with King Hussein. Charles was a code word that the Israelis had for King Hussein. In the internal communications, they never mentioned him by name. It was always Charles, or sometimes they referred to him as Hayanuka, the infant. Dr. Herzog was a remarkable diplomat and a meticulous record keeper. And his reports were all in English, flawless English, and very, very detailed and informative. After the June 1967 war, Herzog was swept along by the wave of religious nationalism and messianism that overtook Israel, and the tone at the meetings changed completely. Herzog's report on his first meeting with Hussein after the war was in London on the 2nd of July 1967, and the tone had changed. The tone now became that of a headmaster reprimanding a naughty schoolboy. So the Charles file and these reports on all the meetings were my main primary source for reconstructing the dialogue across the battle lines. Hussein was a great believer and practitioner of personal diplomacy. The foreign ministry in Jordan was pretty irrelevant to the conduct of Jordanian foreign policy. It's an understatement to say when Peres was foreign minister in a government headed by Yitzhak Rabin. It was a major breakthrough in the conflict, but it collapsed. And I asked the king about that meeting, and he was very critical of Peres. And I tried to defend Peres. And the king said to me sharply, it was unusual for him to speak sharply, but he said to me, as far as I was concerned, Peres was my Israeli interlocutor. He was a foreign minister. We reached a serious agreement, and then he couldn't deliver. I also interviewed Shimon Peres about the London Agreement. And he said to me, this may surprise you, but I was the most consistent supporter of the Jordanian option in the Labour Party. With Yitzhak Rabin, the chemistry was very different, famously different. The two men had a lot in common. They were both soldiers, they were both heavy smokers, and they both spoke very slowly. More importantly, there was mutual trust. And the king himself said this to me. Many times I put myself in Rabin's shoes, and Rabin put himself in my shoes. This is really an important point about the relationship between them. Many Jordanians told me that the king was an educator. They said to me that the king used to say to them, the Jews have suffered a lot, they've endured a lot, they were persecuted, and therefore they're obsessed with security. So when you meet with Israelis, put that into your equation. Put yourself in their shoes. Reassure them repeatedly that you're not an enemy, that you don't wish them any harm. And many of the people that I interviewed, generals, politicians, and the present king, told me that the king always emphasized the importance of reassuring the Israelis about their peaceful intentions. There was another factor that explains why Hussein and Rabin were able to work so effectively together, and that is Israel's special relationship with the United States. Israel always had a special position in Washington and a lot of influence. For Middle Eastern leaders, consequently, Israel was seen as a vehicle to good relations with America. This was true of the Shah of Iran, it was true of Anwar Sadat and Mubarak, to name but a few. There was the issue when the negotiations began towards the treaty between Israel and Jordan. There was the issue of Jordanian debt to America. And Clinton met with Rabin and Hussein. Hussein asked America to forgive the debt. Clinton turned to Rabin and said, we need your support in Congress. And Rabin replied, Mr. President, we will do our best. Dennis Ross negotiated with Ephraim Halevi and Itamar Rabinovich, who was ambassador to Washington at the time, about everything. And they pressed him to forgive the Jordanian debt to America. And Ross said to them, do you represent Israel or Jordan? They said, we represent both. The climax was a joint session of Congress, both houses of Congress. Rabin and Hussein appeared together. Former Jordanian Prime Minister Tahar al-Masri said to me, Hussein realized he could have never made it on his own. It was like Rabin as the big brother holding his younger brother by the hand and presenting him to the Americans. The personal role of Rabin and Hussein in negotiating the peace treaty was critical. I asked Hussein what did he think about the peace treaty they achieved, and he said to me, it was balanced, it was fair, and it met the essential interests of both sides. So for him, the peace treaty was mission accomplished. The weakness of the peace between Jordan and Israel is that it was so personalized, it was institutionalized. When a crisis occurred, the principles would resolve them. But after the assassination of Rabin, the relations between Jordan and Israel deteriorated. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin was a body blow to King Hussein. He was eloquent at the funeral. When he spoke at the funeral of Rabin, he compared Rabin to a martyr for peace like his grandfather. Randa Habib was a Lebanese journalist who was close to King Hussein. After the funeral, he went back to the King David Hotel. She saw him standing on the terrace, smoking with tears rolling down his eyes. She said to him, what's up? And he said, I've come here to West Jerusalem for the first time in my life to bury a friend. I have a feeling that somehow today I've also buried the peace. These were prophetic words. One last word about my role as a biographer of King Hussein. I have a friend, a Jordanian academic called Mustafa Hamane, who for a period served as the press secretary for King Hussein. Mustafa offered to write a biography of the king. The king turned him down, but according to Mustafa, the king said to him, I am happy that Avi Shlaim is writing a book about me because he is a Jew, he is an Israeli, he knows the history of the family, and he is a professor at Oxford. So there you have it, my putative qualifications to serve as a biographer for a Hashemite king. Thank you.